Everybody's back now, Jose Roberto.
Welcome back, everyone. We know we're in the middle of, a great conversation, and we want, to have more. We would like to have more time, but this is just a space to really encourage everyone to continue this conversation. But before we can get, to get to other avenues or ways to really continue this conversation through the global program and the different spaces where we can continue this conversation, I would like to invite now the speakers from the group to present, quickly what, was your case study about to the plenary, just to everyone to know about it, and what's your main takeaway from that conversation, even if we had, very few minutes for that. Can we start with Mozambique? Nardine?
Thank you, Jose. Well, I bring three takeaways from the group. First is the use of UPR as an empowerment tool for young organizations and young people. And during the discussion, the idea is that we should use the different steps of the UPR to make sure that young people are going to interact with GTP government in this case. We also talked a little bit about the experience of Mozambique on putting together youth organizations and the Ministry of Justice, which is the national convener on human rights. This is the first takeaway. The second takeaway that I bring is the strategy that we can use for advocacy. Sometimes we focus on the laws, and we focus also on the right on the duty bears. But we need to go deeper. As we see the last slide from the presentation from Alfonso, it's important to add to our advocacy at the bottom level, particularly community leaders who has the power to influence their communities, not only to work at the formal level. And final, what I would like also to bring from myself is that we should try also to use the different types of accountabilities that exist at national level. And the experience of Mozambique, for example, we use a tribunal administrative tribunal to revoke ministerial order 59. So we didn't need to go to the parliament. We didn't need to go longer. We used the judicial system to change a norm. In this case, the order 59 that prohibits pregnant girls to attend day shift schools. Over.
Thank you so much, Nardine. Thank you for sharing with us, the case of Mozambique addressing, or using the UPR process for, removing a discriminatory law that was sending girls or pregnant girls to night schools. Thank you so much for your key takeaways. Can we go now to Lucia, who was presenting the case of Kyrgyzstan? And we know Lucia works now in other regions, but we are really thankful for having you here. Over to you, Lucia.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, I'm very attached to the case of Kyrgyzstan, and what the discussion was about, how in Kyrgyzstan, the human rights mechanisms, CRC, CEDAW, CRPD, and UPR all together, and also special procedures, were constantly used from 2012 by all the UNCT really to pass on recommendations or concluding observations on child marriage. There was not a single tool that was not used. And this created a critical mass of strength. It was a drop carving out the stone to the parliament and to the public opinion about the necessity of breaking up the cycle of child marriages. Giving numbers, in 2016, 14.8% of the girls in Kyrgyzstan before 18 were married. And thanks to the reforms that were done with the support of all the UN team and UNICEF, it was created a law that was forbidding underage religious marriages. This law was created thanks to the support of all these recommendations that we have piled up, with the conversation we had with the civil society, but most of all with the support of the religious authorities. One of the questions I had in the brief time we had was, how did we manage to convince the religious communities in supporting this law? Simply by showing the human cases. I gave the example of one story, one real story that we have shown about a woman victim of this crime, and it was shown on video, and I've seen the head imam of Kyrgyzstan really literally crying to see what kind of trauma and desperation was. This law that was passed like in 2018 led with other interventions, with the social norms changes, to the diminution of child marriages in Kyrgyzstan. So while before we had 14.8%, now the new mix 4 years afterwards showed 9.1% with a decrease of 45%. This is a success story. We are talking about 65,000 less women in this crisis. And we are talking about child marriage, but it's also associated with problems with violence against women and with bride kidnapping. The battle has been partially won, but what we are really looking is at the long course on fighting social norms. And within the social norms, we have created a massive amount of videos, and also we have created one application that is targeting children and youth for understanding the causes, the negative causes of child marriage and violence against women. This application was supposed to be, the target was to be downloaded by 30,000 people, now has been downloaded more than 300,000 people, and is very popular in all the former Soviet space. So really talking to the children and to the parents to change social norms, not only through legislation, but using the human rights instruments first. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lucia. And I think the interesting, and I think the case study that you share, not only in terms of the successful, but the process itself is showing how the whole UN system can work together to advance this accountability process using the human rights mechanisms. Thank you so much, Lucia. Could I invite now Uganda? Please, Florence, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alfonso, and thanks, Mozambique. I think already shared some of the aspects for Uganda in terms of the example we use. It's advocacy for returning pregnant girls to school in line with supported UPR recommendations. And for the case of Uganda, we have a national advocacy and tracking tool in place. And that's what we use for advocacy for return of pregnant girls to school. We have a national mechanism in place where we have the Interministerial Human Rights Committee in place that coordinates the development of the National Human Rights Action Plan in response to the UPR recommendation. By doing it at interministerial committee level, that's actually part of the political accountability, but it also has the leverage to coordinate the different arms of government, the ministries, departments, and agencies, and hold them accountable to the implementation of the National Human Rights Action Plan. So in the case of Uganda, for this successful advocacy, we had different frameworks in place with different stakeholders playing different roles. A Ministry of Gender developed the National Strategy to End Child Marriage and Teenage Pregnancy that was also multi-sectoral, addressing the health aspects as well as the social aspect. While the Ministry of Education and Sports did a study that showed the correlationship between high school dropout and teenage pregnancy, and all this together with the civil society organizations mobilizing and organizing community, using life skills to build the agency of the girls themselves, provided pressure that held the different actors accountable and contributed to a successful advocacy for returning pregnant girls to school. The key takeaway from the group discussion brings to the mutually reinforcing strategies using both administrative, social, political accountability and the different form of programming and approaches from the actual service delivery that generates evidence that we can use for actually monitoring and tracking accountability, as well as contributing to the UPR process. Let's seize the opportunity.
I think her connection might be playing up a bit, Jose.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Florence. You know, unfortunately, I think we lost your connection, but thank you everyone, in that group as well. Can we move now to Maldives? We are traveling around the world here.
Okay.
Over to you, Sajid.
Yeah. Thank you. And in our group, we focused a lot on comprehensive sexuality education and also use of the international human rights mechanisms to advocate for comprehensive sexuality education and make the state accountable to providing SRH information and services. As you know, in our group, we acknowledge that, many countries were, Muslim countries, and some countries had, very strong other religions also influencing. So one factor that we all discussed and agreed is when it comes to religion, especially Islam, where Sharia law and the social situation obstructs provision of this sort of sensitive issues, it becomes a challenge to engage. So the case of Maldives is because we don't have a lot of space in the country to advocate and also work with the government, the use of international human rights mechanism was the most important avenue that we had, where we engage young people, we engage civil society, and use every opportunity we get, from Nairobi Summit to UPR, and also the CEDAW process, which is happening even right now as we speak, and to keep the agenda of comprehensive sexuality education and the right to SRHR information as an important aspect to prevent from child marriage, or even to make everyone choose with informed consent and decision when they get married, on with who they get married. So this was an important avenue. And also, when it comes to religion, this is a strong cultural pushback, and the message was around, we have to really learn from each other on seeing how we play around with, the messaging, common messaging, to working with the faith-based organizations to bring about this sort of advocacy change in the process. Yeah, in the case of Maldives, using this international process is the only way we could keep the agenda alive. So that was the discussion in our group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shadia. And this is a real example how human rights accountability could really create an enabling environment for advancing this agenda on the elimination of child marriage. Thank you so much. Can we go now and travel to Panama? Shelley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jose Roberto. So in our group, we discussed the example of a process of political advocacy to increase political, social, and international accountability in a region where, prior to the release of the SDGs and of the Global Programme, no one was talking about child marriage, child early and forced marriage in Latin America and the Caribbean. It was a non-issue, even though adolescent girls were living it and being affected by it. So really the example that was discussed was a process of partnership, confirmation, alliance building between civil society, UN organizations, women and girl-led organizations, in order to occupy spaces that are intergovernmental, that are interinstitutional, and that are multi-sectoral, in order to put child early and forced marriage on political and social agendas, and managing political and social agendas, as well as engaging regional human rights instruments such as the Belém do Pará Convention to end all forms of violence against women and girls. The process it's an ongoing process, and what we've managed to garner so far in this process are clear commitments. We're hoping for increased investments in terms of attention from government, civil society, and international partners within the monitoring of the regional gender agenda, where finally child marriage is included as a measure. The SDG indicators included within the Gender Equality Observatory in the region that also requires approval and endorsement from civil society and ministries of women's affairs, meaning that finally child marriage and early unions from a point of zero discussion and silence is now recognized as a key indicator for gender equality and girls' rights in the region, as well as the inclusion of or the dedication of the hemispheric report on Belén do Pará being dedicated to child marriage and early unions that's being released this year. So that's the process so far of what we've been doing and what we shared. I would say that the takeaway is in terms of the power of partnerships and joint actions to hold duty bearers responsible and to engage rights holders in the process, ensuring that adolescent girls are at the center of breaking silence and ensuring the right and responsible actions for their rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shelley. And we know how powerful this multi-stakeholder platform of Aliadas has been in a very short period of time. Thank you for joining us. Let's go to East and Southern Africa. Anandita, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jose Roberto. So actually in our session, what we discussed was something called the SADC model law. SADC is a Southern African Development Community that brings together parliamentarians from across Southern Africa, 14 member states, to sort of advance legislative and policy issues that are critical for development. And a few years ago, they reached out to UNFPA, UNICEF, Girls on Brides, Plan International, saying that there was a real need from member states to have a sort of model law on what are the legislative frameworks when we're talking about child marriage, and in a comprehensive way, you know, looking at the full set of measures that needed to be put in place. So it goes beyond a legislative document. It actually covers policy and budgetary concerns as well. And so I shared what the model law was in very, very brief, as well as some of the ways it can be used and should be used by different partners. And then in the discussion we had, which was very interesting, I think there were 4 main key takeaways that I took away. One is that it was so critical that we needed buy-in. So one of the questions I got was, how did you ensure that this model law was then actually used at national level, you know? And that is how you see the success of something like a model law. And what was critical was the parliamentarians' role, active role in shaping that model law, and then taking it to their countries and working with line ministries and other partners to actually help make that legislative changes. And the CSO engagement and the youth engagement were also absolutely critical to push this forward. That's the first piece, the buy-in. The second was about budgetary. So, you know, another point that was raised is that if we have a great law that's based on human rights, you know, mechanisms at global, regional and national levels, but there is no budget to actually implement the revisions, then it doesn't go anywhere. And actually the SADC model law has an entire subsection, a chapter on budgetary considerations that you need to have in place if you want to actually go through a legislative change. So that was the second takeaway, the budget. The third takeaway is that this is not a standalone. You know, the SADC model law is one of many accountability mechanisms we can and should be using to advance work around child marriage and related issues around sexual and reproductive health, around protection, around education. And an example that was shared was about a scorecard, a citizenship scorecard, but we also have SRH scorecards, gender equality scorecards, which are also critical ways to build accountability and have member states reporting back on what they're doing. And then the final thing I just want to leave with, Jose Roberto, is that the South-South sharing is critical. So in the group, Mozambique shared how they actually implemented and used the SADC model law. And there were several interests from other parts of the world, from the Middle East, from Asia, about how can we use something similar or what are the lessons we can take. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Anandita. You can read my smile. Thank you, everyone, for the great conversation. I can see the chat is really active. That means that this session is getting, you know, not only our interest, but also is giving us, you know, different avenues, opportunities. I like this idea of the avenue, a way that we can use to advance the agenda. And we can see, I don't want to say more than the takeaways that have been shared, but just to remember that, you know, human rights is critical. There is a pushback against, you know, gender equality, against human rights, against democracy around the world. And this is also something that can affect all what we are doing in terms of accelerating the action to end child marriage. And as Global Programme, we have the opportunity, and we have been working with civil society organizations, that we have the opportunity to keep improving our role in making sure that the civil society organizations and the right holders, the young people, the girls, they have an active role as citizens to really reshape the relationships, the power relationships around, the space in the public arena. And as Global Programme, we can continue supporting the administrative, the social, the political, the international accountability, taking advantage of the human rights mechanisms and all the platforms that we have been creating, along the way during decades, and as the result of the human rights movements around the world, particularly, women's rights, youth rights, and, the people fighting for, recognition of the gender identity and sexual orientation. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for all the countries, the great interaction. This is just the start. Let's continue. We have different processes within the Global Programme, the GPSU, the different channels. We have FILO. So let's continue and make, the governments and the, the duty bearers accountable, because this is an obligation and the human rights should be protected, respected, and fulfilled. Thank you, everyone.